Good evening, wherever you are. My name is Arun Gupta. I am the Vice President and General Manager for Open Ecosystem Team at Intel. You can learn all about us at open.intel.com. We also have an excellent podcast about open.intel.com, open.intel.com/podcast. If you want to be a guest, reach out to us and we would love to have you there. This morning, I am super happy to be with Kapil. Hey, Kapil.
Hi, how's it going?
I'm doing very well. Kapil and I, a backstory. Kapil and I used to work together back at Amazon, and I left Amazon in 2020. And Kapil was one of the first people that I told that, hey, Kapil, I'm leaving Amazon. His immediate response was like, oh man, you just beat me like by a week or so. And then I always knew he was super passionate about Cloud Custodian. So I'm super happy and excited, to talk about all about Cloud Custodian, what it is, Stacklet, and how the journey has been so far. Couple, tell us what do you do?
I am the lead maintainer of Cloud Custodian and also the CTO and co-founder of Stacklet, which is trying to help bring some of the value of Cloud Custodian to enterprises as sort of out of the box. And I've been a developer for most of my career, and got started in open source in like the late 90s and sort of never really looked back. Got into cloud early, mid 2000s when it was App Engine, and AWS didn't even have EC2. And I've continued to watch the growth of the cloud and see its transformation on the ecosystem and on how enterprises and organizations deploy applications. And I guess we're now in the midst of a new revolution, the generative AI one. So super excited about being here today and getting a chance to talk about Cloud Custodian and how it helps people manage their cloud footprints.
That's wonderful. And I remember when I started these webinar series back in October, November, you were one of the first people that said, oh, Arun, this is a wonderful idea. So I'm really glad that we're able to bring you on this series to talk about Cloud Custodian and all the wonderful things that it happens to do. All right, what is Cloud Custodian? Tell us.
So Cloud Custodian is a YAML-based rules engine. It helps you find interesting resources of a particular type through some arbitrary sets of filtering, and then take some actions on them. And off those simple set of primitives, you can do all kinds of things from security, operations, compliance, cost savings, to be able to make sure that your cloud footprint is well managed. So a large organization typically is adopting the cloud. They've got hundreds of developers or thousands of developers doing different things, and regardless of the individual technology choices and paths that those developers may take to deploy their applications into the cloud, the organization wants to make sure that its policies are in effect regardless, turning off development environments at night, making sure that all data is encrypted at rest. And so Cloud Custodian is a tool with that simple YAML rules engine to be able to affect all of those changes inside of the environment and do that on a real-time basis as well.
Okay. Now, when you say Cloud Custodian, and let's pick sort of the major cloud providers, Amazon, Microsoft, Google, all of them have their own tools that does something similar. AWS has config rules, Google, Microsoft, I'm sure has something similar as well. What is the value of Cloud Custodian in that sense?
So Cloud Custodian provides we differ in that we try to integrate with the native tools wherever possible. So, and if you look at AWS config, Custodian is actually the easiest way to write an AWS config rule. But we also, with like a 20x line of reduction versus trying to write a config rule by hand and deploy it. So we integrate in provisioning with serverless functions into those environments, as well as being able to initiate real-time behavior based on the API audit logs. So we try to integrate with the native capabilities. So Google Cloud Security Command Center, Azure Policies, AWS Config, AWS Security Hub, whatever those native capabilities are, we want to be the easiest way for people to consume them and to be able to respond to changes in the environment. So we also keep up with the pace of innovation on the cloud by constantly adding new resources in response to new announcements, new feature sets from the cloud provider. But the core capability set is multi-cloud, B, tends to operate in real time and allow you to do enforcement on these things, not just being able to be another reporting tool. And then C, being able to have something that's much more readable. Like one of the things that, when you're in a large organization and you've got, hundreds or thousands of policies that you want to affect, you want to make sure that these things are readable, not just to the person that wrote them, but to an auditor or to a developer in an environment, and being able to make that transparent. And then additionally, one of the things that we do differently, I think, than some of the native tools, beyond integrating them, is that we try really hard to drive the feedback directly to the developer. So, if you put a database on the internet, Custodian can shut it down and then send you a Slack message. Hey, you put a database on the internet, it's okay. Here's a corporate policy on doing it correct in the future, and we shut it down for you. And so being able to drive that behavior change back to the developer really helps close some of the information gaps and loops within a larger organization.
Yeah, sounds good. So multi-cloud is a big benefit, but let's say if I'm a developer or I'm a customer or I'm a company that is only using AWS, should I be worried about, should I be concerned about, should I be thinking about Cloud Custodian at all, or I'm happy just with the AWS config itself?
We've got a bunch of users that are single cloud users, and they still find that Custodian provides significant benefit versus some of the native tools. Part of that is addressability. Like, we actually support more resources than some of the native tools do. Part of that is the speed of response for our native real time tends to be faster than some of the native tools. And then finally, this notion that we're more productive to write in, that you can actually, and that being open source, you can actually, if you need to, you can also add support for particular things, capabilities that you may need, that if you were dependent on a managed service, you'd have to wait for that service team to prioritize that capability.
I hear you. So what you're saying is AWS may launch a service, and that service may not have support in AWS config, but Cloud Custodian being open source, you can add that support over there, so you can actually iterate at a faster cadence and yet be able to leverage that service and do all of that governance that you're interested into.
Exactly. I mean, I think maybe a good example is, just looking at this past reInvent and then continue to use AWS as an example. Amazon launched what they call AWS Cost Optimization Hub. And Custodian, within a month of reInvent, had added support for Cost Optimization Hub. A Cost Optimization Hub itself is basically a bunch of recommendations, as well as dollar amounts that you can save by enacting those recommendations. And Custodian can take those recommendations and already provides the actions to actually directly enact them. And we can all do that a very simple YAML DSL, config that effectively is providing you a custom coding environment to go manually do that. So you'd have to, there's no direct support for it. You'd have to go build it out yourself. Whereas in 5 to 10 lines of YAML, you can achieve some of those cost savings directly with Custodian due to its native integration capabilities.
How much does it provide the feedback back to AWS? Like, let's say the functionality has been added in Cloud Custodian. Do you work back with the CSPs as well that, hey, this is how we believe this feature should be implemented in your config or policy or whatever it is?
It depends. Like, sometimes, we work with some of the larger CSP customers, and so in some cases we're able to directly provide feedback to some of the product teams. In some cases, it's sort of it's a wait till they reach out to us. We've when AWS Security Hub launched, we participated with them on prior to launch to be able to add those capabilities so that they were available as soon as the official launch happened, that the native integration was available in Cloud Custodian. So it tends to vary greatly by service teams and what they want to prioritize, but we're always willing to work with those CSPs to be able to enable those features at launch for their customers.
Beautiful. I understand you have some slides that you can talk about sort of the flow of Cloud Custodian. Let's get into it.
Sure. So, and just, covering off on what, Cloud Custodian is actually in the Cloud Native Compute Foundation as an incubating project. We currently support a number of different providers, AWS, Azure, GCP, Oracle, and actually Tencent Cloud, Kubernetes, Terraform, and all the CSPs actually we've worked with all the CSPs directly. So Azure was contributed by a team at Microsoft, OCI with a team at Oracle, Google, GCP, work through some contractors to help enable that, and AWS also continues to contribute. So in all these cases, on the native CSP side, we directly work with providers to enable that support. We've recently added, maybe a little over a year ago, we added support for being able to do shift left and being able to evaluate custodian policies directly against your infrastructure as code assets. So being able to take this sort of further shift left, further into development environments on a pre-deployment basis, being able to validate that your resources are compliant to your organizational policies. And that's inclusive of native code hosting integrations with GitHub, GitLab, Azure DevOps, etc. So let's take a look at some policies. We've got a lot of contributors. There's some examples here of so what would look like on the bottom is like writing custom code, and then at the top is sort of like the YAML DSL, being able to do sort of tag enforcement against a set of resources. But if we take a look and sort of break down what a policy looks like, a policy is basically has a name, it targets a particular resource type, has a particular execution mode, and this is where you can sort of configure some of the event-based serverless response. Does some set of arbitrary filtering on it, either on a set of attributes of the resource or potentially on additional hops from that resource, going from a VM to its subnet or to its security group or to the metrics associated to that running VM, and then a set of actions that you can take. And those actions can be used in many different contexts. So I might take an action like stop a VM and use that in response to an anomaly detection of like a guard duty event about a particular VM, or I might use it to facilitate off hours, or I might use it as part of a workflow where I've given the developer 2 weeks grace and now I've got to go ahead and stop it before I go ahead and terminate it in a future time.
So actually, go back on the previous slide.
Yeah.
So if I'm using multi-cloud, and if I write this policy, but this one is specifically to AWS, but I could write like a similar policy at a higher level, and that would do my governance in all 3 clouds pretty much alike?
Not exactly. So we generally target down to the low. We're not trying to be an abstraction layer. So we have 2 notions. One is sort of this capability set about runtime resources and being able to do enforcement on them. And in that context, we don't try to provide an abstraction because the underlying capabilities of the cloud that you want to target won't necessarily map to an abstraction. So we found that abstractions can be lossy, let's say, with regards to expression. And so being able to target, a customer managed key or a particular, VM type, or being able to attach a GPU, like all the expression of those things tends to be very different. And we want to be able to express those capabilities down to the raw attributes of the native resource. So we don't abstract. So you'd write a single policy for each of those providers that you care about. There is a distinction in that, as we've done some of our shift left capability set, we've added some additional richness to the policy language, because typically in an infrastructure as code context, we're operating against an in-memory graph. So we're able to do, you can do a single policy that will do multi-cloud tag governance, for example, when you're operating against Terraform. So in the shift left context, some of that does apply. But again, we're not trying to provide multi-cloud abstractions. We're trying to let people govern the actual resources they have in their cloud on a specific basis.
Got it. So essentially, if I have, say, I'm using 3 different clouds, I will have to write 3 separate policies, because there's not an abstraction layer. It's a very CSP-specific, domain-specific language.
Correct.
Got it.
So
okay.
the domain comes from the DSL itself. It's going to be based on what that provider provides back in their service APIs. So you can directly target any of the attributes or operations there.
And do the customers find that easy? Do the customers find it challenging that they have to learn? I understand they are not required to learn the underlying CSP domain-specific language, but now they have to learn, Cloud Custodian specific DSL essentially.
Yeah, and in the context of the Cloud Custodian specific DSL, these attributes directly map to typically the CLI outputs that the cloud CSPs provide. So, we provide a wrapper enclosure that represents a common tooling that can be used across all those different providers, and then the user, of course, when they're writing a policy, has to address the specific attributes that they care about that are going to map to the native capabilities of that cloud. Policy authoring is a capability set that is. One second, I've got some background noise. I'll be right back. Kids in the background. Sorry.
It's all right. This is a very kid-friendly, pet-friendly, family-friendly call.
Fair enough. Yeah, spring break just starting over here. So
there you go. Yeah.
Sorry, and I lost track on where we were, but
no, we were talking about sort of do customers find it challenging that they have to learn 3 different DSLs as opposed to the cloud-specific DSL?
Yeah, so typically the customers that are authoring the policies, like, if they're already in that provider, they already have the domain expertise around that provider, which is the key aspect for writing the policies. The rest of the writing the policies is sort of like the policy authoring, the validation, the execution. That is the common part that we bring, is the common tooling to address across the providers, but the actual attributes that you want to filter on and the actions you want to take are going to be, representative of the, your production workloads that you already have in those clouds, which typically has that, you already have that domain expertise to have those workloads.
Gotcha. Now, talk to me about the poll here. There are different modes, basically poll-based to serverless event-driven execution. Tell me what's the difference between the two, and when and how and what customers would use?
Yeah, so event-based, Custodian supports a couple different execution modes by provider. The key core one that we try to have as a baseline for the providers is this notion of, as an API call is happening, that you're able to subscribe to it, say something like, run instances or, launch a Kubernetes cluster. And in response to that, the policy is able to retrieve the resource and introspect its configuration to make sure it's compliant to the policy. And so when we do those event-based modes, Custodian actually has a built-in serverless provisioning framework. So we'll actually provision a serverless function in the different providers, hook up the event source to those API audit events. In particular, this one, it's an example is AWS config. In this particular case, where instead of hooking the event source is actually going to be setting up a custom config rule, a Lambda function, a custom config rule, and wiring the two together. In GCP, it might be against the API audit log. We also support doing Lambda on CloudTrail. You can also do scheduled periodic ones. Now, when you're going in this event-based mode, you're typically just operating on the changes in your environment. So the difference in poll is that poll-based mode, you're effectively going to be executing against your full footprint. So if this was a poll-based policy, it would be looking at all of the EBS volumes in the account. Whereas as a config rule or as a CloudTrail based policy, it would only be looking at individual resources as they're changing and being modified.
So it's about the granularity, and it's about how quickly you want to take the action, and you can set up the poll or the serverless event-driven execution accordingly.
Yeah, so I mean, putting it as a more concrete example, like, organizations are always learning in the cloud. So, maybe you've discovered, we don't want to use a particular volume type anymore. It's obsolete, but we have a bunch of this stuff already out there, and it's not, it's not a green field. We're learning as we go in the cloud. So you might put together a serverless event-based policy to say, hey, we're going to stop the bleeding. No more. We're not going to allow this to happen anymore in this environment. And so you have an event-based policy. It provides auto remediation and notification to the developer. You've stopped sort of the net new, but now you need to go have a set of policies to go back and clean up what's already out there. So you can actually construct a workflow from a set of policies. So you might say, okay, everyone is in this environment, go fix your stuff. We're going to give you 2 weeks grace. If not, we're going to send you another nag email, and then we're finally going to go ahead and stop it or online resize it for you. And then maybe a week later, if they haven't done that, go ahead and potentially delete the resource. So this is really about like how do you map policies to the real world as well as provide for real world remediation.
Got it. I think that's a very concrete and specific example on how you can do not just policy enforcement, but also get a view of what's happening in your cloud infrastructure. All right, let's keep rolling on the slides.
So yeah, I mean, we've talked a little bit about some of the execution modes. There's a few here. Like I think we're up to like a dozen different execution modes. Mostly we're just going through on different, provisioning the serverless provider and the different clouds, hooking up the event streams. We have rich outputs as far as, inside of each of the providers, we behave like a native app. So we go to their log store, we output to object store, we output to metric store on the different providers so that you're able to use that directly. And then we get to some of the use cases that we can do. If we look at FinOps, we have like a broad set of categories, finding sort of, wasted, unused resources like a database that hasn't had a connection for the last 2 weeks, or a VM that's been oversized, or implementing off hours, or setting up, container registry rules to clear out old images, or object storage lifecycle management. And so those represent sort of different categories of waste that, Custodian handles really well to be able to affect savings for an organization on their cloud footprint.
So actually, go back on the previous slide. Now, this is a very useful information for the folks that are running the cluster or that are managing the IT resources. But what happens? Like, do they get an email? Do they get a dashboard? Or can you even go a step further where you can set up a policy, no connection for 2 weeks to a database, terminate the database, and clean up the resources? So talk to me through that, what that flow looks like once this is in action.
Yeah, so you can structure flows like this notion of real world remediation is meeting organizations with where they are. So say you want to do a particular policy in a development environment where, hey, if the database hasn't been used in 2 weeks, go ahead and delete it. Whereas in production, you're like, if the database hasn't been used in 2 weeks, let's go ahead and send a notification to them and then come back 2 weeks later and say, if you haven't fixed it, go ahead and delete it. Or you want to apply for an exception. An exception to us is just another filter. So, all of that is readily possible in the sense that you can map, the particulars of the remediation you want to affect in an environment directly to policy capabilities. Exceptions as an additional form of filtering, chaining workflows together to give grace periods, and then of course affecting the actual remediation. This with the ability to take actions directly on the resource.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense. Okay, all right, let's look at the next one.
So, on the security compliance side, there's a number of things, various CIS benchmarks and NIST standards that Custodian can help organizations reach. Making sure that every no VMs are on the public internet, everything has encryption at rest, that you've got WAFs on all of your load balancers, minimizing IAM access, and a lot of that we're taking advantage of native capabilities. So if there's on sort of the incident response, like we can hook into Google Cloud Security Command Center, it can detect things like credential exfil or Bitcoin mining, or we can do the same thing with AWS and GuardDuty, where you've got these sort of event-based things where the providers themselves on a native capability are doing a bit of machine learning on the various logs that they have available to them to provide customers this sort of notification, and we can take that notification and through a policy actually affect the remediation of that directly.
Is there a way for the IT admin or person who's managing, say, the AWS account in an org to get a dashboard for seeing what the policy violations are, what the exceptions are, or is that something they will have to kind of create on top of Cloud Custodian?
Yeah, so Custodian in the open source is of the philosophy that enterprises are sort of have a lot of dashboards, and that the best dashboard that you can have in an organization is the one you're already using. So Custodian has these rich outputs back into the native capabilities of the cloud provider, either object storage, metrics, logging, tracing, but we also have native integrations into some of the dashboards the providers themselves have. So on AWS, we can directly output resources into into AWS Security Hub. In GCP, we can output those resources to Google Cloud Security Command Center. We've seen organizations set up custom dashboards with Datadog, and so we try to be agnostic to where people want to visualize that and provide the richness of data outputs that they can index and provide dashboards or use whichever dashboard they're already using.
That makes sense because you don't want dashboard to become yet another tool that they have to learn. Organizations probably already have a bunch of dashboards, so you serving the usual formats that they would expect, and then integrating your existing dashboard, whether it's a Grafana dashboard or it's a Datadog dashboard or a custom dashboard, but the standard formats are made available by which they can interpret the meaning of it.
Yeah, I mean we've seen people do Splunk. Like there are many single panes of glass dashboards in the enterprise. So we just want to make sure that we provide the data outputs so that they can be integrated into those existing panes.
That makes sense. All right, let's keep rolling then.
And then on operations, so like typically some of this gets into tag management, making sure that your limits are automatically being monitored or are being monitored and automatically resized to what's actually being consumed. Be able to do some of this infrastructure as code scanning, like we've seen people do this for do network oriented things on making sure that there's that they've got the right NAT setups for their subnets, so that they're not getting cross AZ talking. We've seen people do like out of region backups for DR purposes. It's really the flexibility of the tool is just that it's providing you the vocabulary, and it's really about how you choose to use it to achieve those goals for your own organization.
All right, I have my first question here.
Go for it.
Which is, how can we find the mapping of a resource to be defined in YAML against a specific CSP?
So typically you just do the CLI command for that resource. So for a VM, it's typically like, describe VMs and look at that output, and that output maps one-to-one to the default value filter. So here I've got an IAM role and I've got role name, and so that corresponds directly to the output of AWS IAM list roles, and from that output you can directly map to the attributes that are exposed.
So maybe
you use your CLI. Sorry to interrupt, but typically you just use your CLI, your cloud provider CSP CLI. Look at the list or describe a particular resource and use those attributes in your policy directly.
Gotcha. So let's say I'm playing with AWS. I can use the AWS CLI, describe, like say VM. I want to do something on the VM or on IAM or whatever it is. I describe that resource using the CSP specific CLI, and whatever it gives me, I grab that and put it into the DSL over here.
Yes. So the attributes that come out of that are the same attributes that the custodian policy is going to be evaluating. We've definitely looked at whether or not we can make that process easier by being able to include some of those SDK, some of those attributes directly within our own documentation. We're actually looking at doing a documentation sprint later this year at PyCon in Pittsburgh, I believe in April, to be able to see if we can add some of those attributes directly into the our Cloud Custodian docs, so that make that easier. But in the absence of that, what people typically do, they just use the CLI, get the describe or list. The attributes that are in those are the same ones that you can use in your policy.
And to further kind of minimize the effort, because I know when you're using AWS CLI, you can say spit out the content as text or JSON or YAML. You can actually ask it to spit out YAML, and then it could be mostly just a copy paste.
Yeah, exactly. Like you can directly use those. I mean, you're typically looking for the attribute names that you care about, or in this case, if you want to directly use the output directly, because it maps directly to that type, then you can just directly copy that over.
Got it. Thank you, Sujay, for that question. All right, let's keep rolling then.
And then, yeah, so, as an example, sort of more on the operation side, like, hey, let's proactively look for an App Engine certificate that's going to expire, and then send a notification. So, this is again the key aspect of custodian is this notion of tagging all the resources so that you know who owns a resource, and then being able to start doing notifications to the resource owners when they have something that's potentially non-compliant with policy. And it's really about helping drive the behavior change, because organizations get large enough, their footprints get large enough that it becomes really hard to otherwise manage or know who to talk to about a particular asset.
So in this case, for example, and pretty much all other cases, just to get my flow right, I write the DSL for Cloud Custodian. I apply that using the Cloud Custodian CLI to my cloud provider. It gets translated into the cloud provider specific policies and configs. And then in this particular case, for example, it's like a cron job. And every day, maybe it'll trigger that, hey, is the new certificate expiring? If it is, then it's going to send a mail to ops@example.com.
So in this particular case, this policy is not set up is effectively just going to run on the CLI. So because this policy isn't specifying an execution mode, so it's getting the default, which is pull. So you might set up custodian on a VM and just have it run in a cron job that you set up yourself.
I see.
We've seen people use it doing Cloud Run and Kubernetes and on VMs and Jenkins. In that sense, when you're doing pull-based policies, you're providing sort of it's bring your own compute, and how you want to execute it is really that context up to you. Now, when you specify an execution mode, that's when we do the build out to the serverless runtime for the cloud provider.
I see. Okay. So that was the difference between the mode part of it, that it gives you the pull or a serverless execution mode that trigger this every time whenever this policy occurs. Okay. All right. Keep rolling.
And then Custodian has built-in command line help. We have a schema for all of our policy language directly there inside of the CLI, and it has built-in help and examples. We use that same to generate all of our docs. And we have built-in validation on the CLI. Typically, we recommend organizations do sort of like GitOps practices around their custodian policies, where, as part of checking policies in, that you're running to validate, that as you go to execute policies, that you're pulling them out from what's been committed. And so that tends to be the path that organizations do best with. We've seen various forms of that, where an organization might have, an overarching enterprise-wide set of repos that are policies across the org, but then they might decentralize for, particular accounts or particular app teams, so that they can run their own policies specific to that part of the organization or to that individual team. And so they can layer, but that's still, just trying to adhere to that best practice of making sure your policies are, in version control, that they're being reviewed as they're being deployed.
Got it. No, yeah, I'm glad you brought up this slide, because I was just about to ask, for somebody who is using multi-cloud and they want to get started with Cloud Custodian, let's say I have hundreds of VMs running. how do I get started? Like, download the CLI, start writing my DSL, start placing them. How would I get started?
Yeah, so I mean, inside of the Cloud Custodian website, we've got docs, we've got lots of examples. We have a fairly active Slack community with a few thousand people, and we're also represented in certain sub-communities, like the FinOps Foundation Slack has a Cloud Custodian channel with about 3,000 people. So really, it's about trying out the tool, download it, install it, play around with the docs, come ask questions. We're all pretty friendly. We have users asking for ideas or help with policies, on a regular basis, and there's generally folks around that can help you get started.
Okay. Another question that I have is, let's say Kubernetes is a de facto compute layer, and next week KubeCon is happening. And I know Custodian and Cube are good friends, and I mean it's a incubation sandbox project. Sandbox or incubation right now?
We're incubating. We've been incubating for a little over a year.
Yes, it's an incubating project at CNCF. Now, I could be running Kubernetes as my de facto layer across multiple cloud providers. How would Cloud Custodian help me? Do I learn the Kubernetes language? Do I learn a CSP language? How does it help me with that part?
Yeah, so in Kubernetes, it's nice because the runtime definition is the same as the declaration format. But custodian support for Kubernetes includes both validating and mutating emission controllers from sort of an event mode, and then additionally being able to work on a poll-based mode directly against the cluster control plane. So you can do things like, hey, make sure that I've got pod enforcement on security budgets and on memory and CPU, that I've got labels attached to things, and you can be able to do that both directly against your definition files, on a poll-based mode against a cluster, or as either a mutating or validating emission controller. On the mutation side, what we've seen one common thing to do is just make sure we auto-label things with whoever the creating user is.
Yeah. So in that case, all I'm learning is the Kubernetes-specific DSL as opposed to a cloud-specific DSL. So that could be one advantage of using Kubernetes as a de facto compute layer. No matter where it runs, because this Cloud Custodian is talking the Kubernetes language, you could just cover it across multiple clouds as well. Kapil, this is fantastic. Is there anything that? Oh, actually, one more question. Cloud Custodian has an impressive set of customers. Talk to me what those customers look like and what kind of things that they do with Cloud Custodian. Are there any case studies that you can walk us through?
Custodian. So we do a Cloud Custodian Day every year. We've had folks from Capital One, Intuit, JPMC, Datadog come present. I would encourage folks that are interested in Custodian has thousands of large enterprise production users. And they've talked about some of their experiences, and at Cloud Custodian Day, all those videos are online. And if people are interested in learning more, I definitely would encourage. But to speak at a high level, we've seen secure organizations with thousands of custodian policies in terms of managing their fleet across different domains, from security, governance, compliance, sort of the full capability set of what Custodian offers. And they do that on real-time enforcement. They do that as sort of a linchpin of how they manage their cloud footprint. Custodian is interesting as an open source project because let's take a database as an example, like Postgres. You see Postgres or adoption happen on organically on an app team basis. What we've seen with Custodian is that it tends to be adopted organically, but it's centralized directly into cloud engineering or security or FinOps teams, and then employed against the entire footprint.
That's wonderful, actually. And it's really good to see Cloud Custodian being so widely successful. Now, you mentioned large enterprises. Is Cloud Custodian a good target for SMBs or a smaller company that are all in on a single cloud provider, but they might say, oh, you know what, Cloud Custodian is too much of an overhead for us? Would somebody think like that?
Yeah, I think the intent was, with Custodian was, even though it originated as an enterprise, was to always make it scale down to a mom and pop shop. So we have people deploying single policies, just for off hours inside of their development environments. Really, I think the value chain for Custodian really happens when the organization's cloud footprint is just too big to keep in any one person or one team's head. And so we've seen that, operate down to, people with a few million of cloud spend or, over 20 developers tends to be a good attachment point.
Wonderful. What role does Cloud Custodian have a role to play in any of this LLM explosion, Gen AI explosion that is happening?
Not directly, not yet. To the extent that the cloud providers themselves offer new capabilities based on that functionality that we'll be able to directly, tie into it to be able to let users consume that capability, that native capability most effectively. We have looked at what does it mean to, at least on I guess the Stacklet commercial side, what does it mean to be able to provide IDEs around this capability set that can help facilitate making policy authoring easier. But directly within the project itself, it's really going to be about the ways that the providers themselves expose it so that we can allow for policies to directly take advantage of those capabilities.
Gotcha. Yeah, so the underlying infrastructure is still all cloud. So Cloud Custodian is very relevant for all the underlying infrastructure, the policy enforcement and all, because particularly with Gen AI, as you're training your model, as you're doing the inferencing, the CPU, GPU, TPU, whatever you have, this could just grow exponentially, and then setting those policies with Cloud Custodian could be very helpful in that case.
Yes, a developer with a large GPU, like the most expensive instances are the ones with the big GPUs on them. We've already seen contributed support from enterprises for Amazon's Bedrock capability set, against Google's Colab. There's with those capability sets for governing your AI ML environments on the training side and the inference side, or it exists within Custodian today.
Wonderful. Kapil, this has been a lot of fun. Is there anything I should have asked about Cloud Custodian that we didn't get to talk about today?
Only what's next.
Talk about it.
With regard, yeah, so we continue to expand out capabilities in terms of being able to do shift left, being able to take advantage of new resources and new services that are in the cloud providers. I think we've added maybe 200 resources in the last year. And then adding new providers. In the last year, we also added both Tencent Cloud and Oracle Cloud support. And so looking at, what's coming in the future and trying to see, I think we're continuing to want to work with additional providers and also look at, data center capability sets, potentially on a virtualization basis, but always interested in exploring and seeing where users want to see us be used.
That's fair, yeah, because right now it does seem like it's Cloud Custodian, but it's very heavily favored towards public cloud, and there is plenty of private cloud floating around, VMware, whatever your virtualization software is. So I think having that capability in the private cloud would really allow Cloud Custodian to grow more vast and wild.
And even coming to places that are not traditionally considered cloud, like looking at GitHub repository organization policy enforcement. So again, we're a policy engine. We were born natively in cloud, but we continue to look at additional use cases around other places where we can provide that detection, enforcement, and remediation of resources.
So I guess in that case, the definition of a cloud becomes a bit more nebulous, right? Cloud could be public cloud, could be private cloud, could be GitHub cloud. It doesn't matter really. End of the day, it's a YAML-based rules and policy enforcement engine. Wherever that could be applied, you can plug into that particular provider and say, yep, this is a consistent language. So Cloud Custodian sort of become your de facto language across all the tools you use in terms of policy enforcement, essentially.
Exactly. As we look at, we've already done sort of our shift left capability set. We're just operating against files on disk, and so continuing to address organizational needs and problems where they exist, and finding out where that next pain point is.
That's cool. Right before the webinar started, we and I were talking about you're heading to KubeCon. What is your talk at KubeCon about?
I'm just doing a lightning talk on saving money in the cloud using Cloud Custodian.
Saving money in the cloud. That's always a good thing to do. Awesome. Well, good luck for your talk. I will see you at KubeCon Paris. And thank you, everybody. Happy Friday. And hope everybody has a wonderful weekend.
Thanks.
Bye, everybody.